November 15, 1943. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Rabaul. Commander Masatake Okumiya's hand froze over the intelligence report, his mind refusing to accept what the aerial reconnaissance photographs revealed. The Americans had completed operational airstrips on Bougainville faster than any Japanese engineering manual prescribed possible. The photographs showed fighters operating from Torokina Field, with work proceeding on bomber strips at unprecedented speed. Construction crews were visible in the photographs, working even as American fighters took off and landed around them. Through the window of the fortified command bunker, he could see Japanese construction crews still struggling to repair damage to Rabaul's runways from bombing raids weeks earlier. 300 men working 16-hour shifts for 5 days had barely managed to fill the craters from a single raid. Yet these photographs showed Americans had carved operational airfields from virgin jungle while under intermittent Japanese shelling and air attack. In Berlin, similar disbelief gripped the German General Staff. Colonel Hans von Greifenberg, head of the Wehrmacht's Foreign Armies Intelligence Section, studied reports filtering in through neutral Swedish diplomatic channels and Spanish merchant marine observers. The Americans were constructing complete airbases on Pacific islands, in timeframes that violated every principle of military engineering the Wehrmacht understood. The reports seemed so fantastic that many German officers dismissed them as Allied propaganda. What neither Commander Okumiya nor Colonel von Greifenberg knew was that they were witnessing the most revolutionary transformation in military construction capability in modern warfare. The United States Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were rewriting the mathematics of war not with superior firepower or brilliant strategy, but with bulldozers, coral crushers, and an industrial efficiency that would systematically dismantle Japanese defensive strategy across 4 million square miles of the Pacific Ocean. The revolution had begun with disaster on December 7, 1941. When Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, they simultaneously struck Wake Island, where 1,200 American civilian contractors were building military installations. Under international law, civilians could not resist military attack. Those who did faced execution as guerrillas. 98 of these men were murdered by Japanese forces, their deaths highlighting a critical vulnerability in America's Pacific strategy. Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, understood the implications immediately. Modern warfare in the Pacific would require the construction of hundreds of bases across thousands of islands. Civilian contractors were impossible to protect and legally prohibited from defending themselves. On December 28, 1941, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Morrell requested authorization to create militarized naval construction battalions. By January 5, 1942, he received approval to recruit men from the construction trades for military service. The acronym CB quickly became Seabees, and with it was born a force that would prove more devastating to Japanese strategy than any battleship or bomber squadron. The recruitment was unlike anything in American military history. Men aged 18 to 50, some even older who lied about their age, brought skills from every construction trade in America. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, heavy equipment operators, engineers, surveyors, demolition experts. The average age was 37, far older than typical military recruits. These were men who had built America's skyscrapers, bridges, and dams during the Depression. Now they would build the infrastructure of victory. Captain William Painter, a civil engineer from San Francisco who commanded the 47th Naval Construction Battalion, would later write in his classified report. The Japanese based their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that base construction required months of preparation. They calculated American advance rates based on traditional engineering timelines. They never imagined we would reduce those timelines by factors of 10 or 20. The first stunning demonstration came at Espiritu Santo in July 1942. A small detachment from the 1st Construction Battalion arrived on July 8 with minimal equipment. 6 tractors, 2 scrapers, 1 grease truck, 1 gas wagon, 3 weapons carriers, and 1 50-kilowatt generator. They were supported by 295 infantrymen, 90 Marines, and 50 local workers. The Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal, just 630 miles away, was nearing completion. Allied forces desperately needed a base from which to launch attacks before Japanese bombers could threaten the sea lanes to Australia. The Seabees were given 20 days to build a 6,000-foot runway through virgin jungle. They completed it in exactly that time, working around the clock in tropical heat and torrential rains. The jungle was so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Trees 150 feet tall had to be felled, their massive roots dynamited from coral substrate. Swamps had to be drained, hills leveled, valleys filled. On July 28th, the first fighter squadron landed. The next day, B-17 flying fortresses arrived. The race for Guadalcanal had been won before the Marines even landed. Lieutenant Commander Yasumi Doi of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet wrote in a report discovered after the war, "We calculated the enemy would require 3 months minimum to establish air operations from Espiritu Santo. When bombers appeared after 3 weeks, we assumed they were carrier-based. The possibility of land-based aircraft never occurred to us. Our entire tactical planning was based on false assumptions. The Japanese had good reason for their calculations. Their own construction methods on Guadalcanal required 2,524 men working for 4 months to build a single runway. The project had been considered a marvel of Japanese efficiency, utilizing forced labor from Korea and Formosa, with workers dying daily from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition. Yet the runway remained unpaved, turned to mud in heavy rains, and lacked proper drainage. Japanese construction still relied heavily on manual labor, with workers carrying individual baskets of dirt and stones. German military observers, studying Pacific operations to understand American capabilities, were equally skeptical. Major Kurt von Tippelskirch, analyzing reports for the German High Command, cabled Berlin in September 1942. Japanese report American construction capabilities in Solomon Islands impossible to reconcile with known engineering principles, suggest propaganda or exaggeration. No military force can build operational airfields in reported timeframes. But the timeframes were real, and they were about to get shorter. At Guadalcanal itself, after the Marines captured the partially completed Japanese airfield on August 7, 1942, the 6th Naval Construction Battalion went to work. Despite nightly shelling from Japanese naval forces and daily bombing raids, they had Henderson Field operational in 6 days. More remarkably, they kept it operational. Japanese pilots reported with increasing frustration that craters from their morning bombing runs were filled and repaired before their afternoon missions. The repair speed seemed impossible to Japanese observers. A 500-pound bomb would create a crater 30 feet wide and 10 feet deep. The Seabees would have it filled, compacted, and matted within 4 hours. During the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Henderson Field was shelled by Japanese battleships firing 14-inch shells. The runway was operational again by dawn. Captain Toshikazu Omei, operations officer for the Japanese Southeast Area Fleet, wrote, "It is like fighting the tide. No matter how much damage we inflict, by the next dawn the airfield operates as if nothing happened. They repair faster than we can destroy." The secret lay not just in American equipment, but in revolutionary construction methods that Japanese and German observers initially failed to comprehend. The Seabees had perfected the use of Marsden matting, also called pierced steel planking, that could create instant runways over coral or dirt. Each piece was 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, with 87 holes that allowed drainage and prevented mud buildup. The pieces interlocked like a giant jigsaw puzzle. A single Seabee battalion could lay 2,000 feet of runway per day. Japanese engineers, still building runways by hand-laying individual stones, required a month to complete what Seabees accomplished in an afternoon. But the matting was just one innovation. The Seabees had developed coral crushing techniques that turned the Pacific's abundant coral into perfect runway material. Coral, when crushed and rolled, created a surface nearly as hard as concrete. Mobile crushing plants could process coral into runway material at 100 tons per hour. Japanese equipment, when it existed at all, managed perhaps 5 tons per day. Chief Carpenter's mate Robert Stetson of the 46th Battalion described the process. "We'd hit the beach with the assault waves. While Marines were still shooting, we'd have bulldozers running. D-Day +1, we're crushing coral. D+3, we're laying matting. D+5, fighters are landing. The Japs would still be falling back to their second defense line while we're servicing bombers for strikes on their home islands." The equipment advantage was overwhelming. A single date bulldozer could move 1,000 cubic yards of earth in one day, work that required 500 Japanese or Korean laborers. American truck-mounted drilling equipment could blast through coral at rates that Japanese engineers, using hand drills and hammers, found incomprehensible. The Seabees had routers that could rip out entire trees, roots and all, in minutes. They had graders that could level a field in hours. They had rollers that could compact coral into runway-hard surfaces. By November 1942, intercepted Japanese communications revealed growing panic among their Pacific commanders. Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet, signaled Tokyo. Enemy construction capabilities exceed all planning parameters. They build faster than we can destroy. Request immediate revision of defensive timeline assumptions. Tokyo's response reflected disbelief. The Imperial General Headquarters initially refused to accept the reports, insisting field commanders were exaggerating American capabilities to excuse their own failures. The German Kriegsmarine, monitoring Pacific operations to understand American capabilities that might be deployed in Europe, was equally stunned. Admiral Karl Donitz's war diary for March 15, 1943 noted, American Pacific base construction reports, if accurate, indicate engineering capacity that could establish major ports on European invasion beaches within days rather than weeks. Implications for Atlantic Wall defense require urgent review. The Seabees' achievements accelerated through 1943. On New Georgia, they built an airfield at Munda while still under Japanese artillery fire. The Japanese had spent months building the original field. The Seabees rebuilt and expanded it in 2 weeks. On Vella La Vella, they constructed a fighter strip in 10 days on what Japanese engineers had declared unbuildable swampland. The Treasury Islands operation in October 1943 demonstrated another dimension of Seabee capability. Landing with New Zealand forces, detachments from the 87th Construction Battalion built a fighter field while the island was still contested. Japanese defenders watched in amazement as bulldozers operated under fire, drivers protected by armor plating welded to their machines. The field was operational before the Japanese had been fully driven from the island. On Bougainville in November 1943, detachments from the 25th, 53rd, 71st, and 75th Construction Battalions landed with the 3rd Marine Division. The Torokina fighter strip became operational December 10th, just over a month after the invasion. The bomber strip at Piva was completed December 30th. Work that Japanese engineers calculated would require 6 months was accomplished in weeks, all while under enemy fire. The construction at Bougainville occurred under conditions that would have stopped traditional military engineers. The area was a swamp covered with jungle. It rained almost continuously. Japanese artillery shelled the construction sites daily. Snipers targeted equipment operators. Yet the work never stopped. Seabees worked in shifts around the clock, using floodlights that drew enemy fire but allowed construction to continue through the night. The transformation of the Marianas in 1944 represented the absolute peak of Seabee achievement. On Saipan in June 1944, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion landed with the assault waves on June 15th. Japanese defenders still held positions overlooking Aslito Airfield. Under constant fire, with Japanese tanks counter-attacking across the runway itself, the Seabees began repairs. 4 days later, the field was fully operational. P-47 Thunderbolts were providing close air support to Marines still fighting less than a mile away. Captain Sakai Oba, one of the few Japanese officers to survive Saipan, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We watched in horror as the enemy built roads through terrain we considered impassable. They erected bridges across gorges in hours. They transformed swamps into solid ground overnight. It was not warfare as we understood it. They were reshaping the earth itself." On Guam, the pattern repeated. The 25th Battalion and the 53rd Battalion landed with the assault forces on July 21st. Orote Airfield, badly damaged by pre-invasion bombardment, was operational within 1 week. The Japanese had held Guam for 2.5 years but had never managed to extend the runway beyond 4,500 feet. The Seabees extended it to 6,000 feet in 10 days. But Tinian represented the ultimate demonstration of Seabee capability. After the island's capture in late July 1944, the 6th Naval Construction Brigade arrived with a mission that seemed impossible. build the world's largest airbase complex in time to support B-29 operations against Japan. The statistics alone seemed fantastic. 6 runways, each 8,500 feet long and 200 feet wide. Hardstands for 265 B-29 superfortresses. Fuel storage for 16 million gallons of aviation gasoline. Bomb storage for 30,000 tons of ordnance. Housing for 50,000 personnel. Complete it all in under 90 days. The Japanese had occupied Tinian for decades. Their own engineers had declared large-scale construction impossible due to the terrain. The island was covered in dense jungle, riddled with caves, and composed largely of sharp coral that destroyed conventional equipment. The highest point was only 545 feet, but the terrain was brutally difficult. Thousands of Japanese defenders still hid in caves, emerging at night to attack construction crews. German intelligence, studying captured Japanese reports, concluded that even with unlimited resources, such a project would require 18 months minimum. The Seabees completed the essential elements in 67 days. Working 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, they moved 11 million cubic yards of coral and earth. To put this in perspective, it was equivalent to digging a canal 10 feet deep, 50 feet wide, and 830 miles long. They paved runways with 900,000 square yards of asphalt produced on site. They laid 20 miles of taxi strips. They erected 1,200 Quonset huts, each assembled in hours from prefabricated sections. They built 6 miles of warehouses, workshops capable of complete aircraft overhauls, and the largest aircraft repair facility in the Pacific. The techniques employed were revolutionary. Instead of clearing jungle by hand, Seabees chained bulldozers together and drove through in formation, clearing hundreds of acres per day. They used shaped charges to blast coral formations, creating instant quarries. They operated rock crushers 24 hours a day, producing aggregate for concrete. They assembled portable asphalt plants that could be operational within days of arriving on an island. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and was now analyzing American capabilities, wrote in September 1944, "The enemy possesses construction abilities that render our defensive calculations meaningless. They do not capture and improve our bases. They create superior facilities from nothing in less time than we require to dig defensive positions. Every island becomes an unsinkable aircraft carrier within days of capture. Traditional defensive strategies based on construction timelines are obsolete." The German military was learning similar lessons from captured intelligence and neutral observers. Major Hans von Luck, analyzing American capabilities for Wehrmacht headquarters, reported, "If Americans can transform coral atolls into major air bases in 2 months, all calculations for European coastal defense must be revised. They will establish beachheads with operational ports and airfields before our reserves can respond." The Japanese Navy's attempts to counter American construction speed proved futile. Operation Tan No. 2 in November 1944 specifically targeted Seabee equipment and personnel on Ulithi Atoll. 24 Kaiten human torpedoes were launched in a desperate attack to destroy bulldozers and construction equipment. The mission failed completely. Within hours of the attack, Seabees had repaired all damage and continued construction without interruption. Lieutenant Sekio Nishina, one of the Kaiten designers, wrote before his own suicide mission, "We cannot match their building. For every airfield we destroy, they build 3. For every bulldozer we eliminate, they land 10 more. We are fighting time itself, and time favors them." The impact on Japanese strategic planning was catastrophic. Their entire defensive concept, the absolute national defense sphere, assumed that each island fortress would require months for Americans to reduce and rebuild. Japanese planners calculated they could shift forces between threatened points because American advance rates would be predictable and slow. Instead, Americans were building operational bases faster than Japanese forces could relocate. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, admitted in a post-war interrogation, "We planned for a war where distances and construction time were our allies. The Seabees eliminated both. They could build an airfield faster than we could sail from one island to another. Our mobility advantage was negated by their construction speed." The prefabrication revolution was equally stunning to Axis observers. Everything from buildings to entire harbor facilities arrived in numbered pieces, ready for assembly. Liberty ships carried knockdown airports in their holds. One ship could deliver everything needed to create an operational airfield: runway matting, control tower sections, fuel tanks, repair shops, barracks, even complete mess halls with refrigeration units. A 100-bed hospital could be unloaded, assembled, and operational within 72 hours. Captain Wilhelm Doms, German naval attaché in Madrid, reported to Berlin after debriefing Spanish merchant sailors, "Americans have industrialized warfare to a degree we never imagined. They mass-produce not just weapons but entire bases. Ships arrive carrying airports in crates. Harbors are assembled like children's toys. The very landscape becomes a factory product." The floating dry docks represented another dimension of Seabee achievement. ABSD-1, assembled at Espiritu Santo from sections towed across the Pacific, could lift an entire battleship for repairs. The dock was larger than any in Japan, created at an advanced base 3,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. When completed, it was 927 feet long and could handle ships up to 90,000 tons. Japanese engineers declared it impossible. German naval architects studying the reports insisted the dimensions must be propaganda. Both were wrong. Captain Minoru Genda, air operations officer for the Japanese First Air Fleet, wrote, "Each American advance brings not just warriors but an entire industrial civilization. They do not fight for islands. They transform them into fragments of America itself." The psychological impact on enemy forces proved as devastating as the physical achievements. Japanese soldiers' letters home, captured and translated, revealed growing despair. Private Shigeo Yamada wrote from Peleliu, "The Americans change the very earth. Mountains disappear overnight. Swamps become airfields. The jungle becomes a city. We prepare to defend for months, but they need only days to destroy us. We are fighting gods who reshape the world." This was not hyperbole. On Peleliu, in September 1944, Seabees used reef blasting techniques that removed 35,000 cubic yards of coral in 48 hours, creating a deep water channel where the Japanese insisted no harbor could exist. They built a 6,000-foot bomber strip on terrain Japanese engineers had declared unbuildable, using armored bulldozers that continued working under artillery fire. When drivers were wounded, replacements took their places without stopping the work. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Seabees faced their most difficult challenge. The island was volcanic ash, not coral, making traditional construction techniques useless. Japanese artillery had pre-registered every square yard of potential airfield sites. Casualties among Seabee units reached 30%. Yet they had the first airfield operational while the battle still raged. A damaged B-29 made an emergency landing on March 4th, while Japanese defenders still held positions overlooking the runway. The German military attaché in Stockholm, studying American capabilities through neutral intelligence sources, reported to Wehrmacht headquarters in January 1945. If Americans can build airfields on Pacific coral atolls in days, they can establish beachheads anywhere on the European coast and make them impregnable before our reserves can respond. Traditional calculations of counterattack windows are obsolete. They bring their logistics with them, complete and functional. He was right. The same Seabee expertise that transformed Pacific islands would soon build Mulberry harbours at Normandy, creating instant ports on open beaches, accomplishing in days what German planners assumed would require captured harbour facilities and months of preparation. The Seabees' most profound impact was on the timeline of the war itself. Japanese war planners had calculated that American advance from Guadalcanal to the Japanese mainland would require 8 to 10 years, assuming 3 to 6 months to reduce and rebuild each major base. Instead, Americans reached the Marianas in 2 years, placing B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo. The acceleration was geometric. Each new base was built faster than the last as Seabees refined their techniques. What took 20 days at Espiritu Santo took 10 days at Treasury Islands. Runways that required weeks in 1942 were completed in days by 1945. The final Japanese assessment was devastating. Commander Chikao Yamamoto, in his intelligence report before Japan's surrender, wrote, "We prepared for a war of distances and time. The Americans eliminated both. Their construction battalions achieved what our best engineers declared impossible. They built civilization faster than we could destroy it. Every calculation, every assumption, every defensive plan was invalidated by their ability to transform any piece of earth into an operational base before our forces could respond. The numbers told an irrefutable story. By war's end, Seabees had built 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, 2,558 ammunition magazines, 700 square blocks of warehouses, hospitals to serve 70,000 patients, tanks for storing 100 million gallons of gasoline, and housing for 1.5 million men. They had operated on more than 300 islands across 6 continents. They had moved more earth than was excavated for the entire Panama Canal. And they had done it all under enemy fire, in hostile conditions, at speeds that pre-war engineering manuals declared impossible. Post-war analysis revealed even more stunning statistics. The average time to build a 5,000-foot fighter strip dropped from 60 days in 1942 to 10 days in 1945. The average time to build an 8,000-foot bomber runway dropped from 90 days to 30 days. By the war's end, Seabees could establish a functioning port facility, complete with piers, warehouses, and fuel storage, in 2 weeks. Japanese forces, even with unlimited labor, required 6 months for similar facilities. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of Japanese forces on Saipan, had written in his final message before committing suicide, "The enemy's power lies not in their numbers, but in their ability to appear anywhere and transform nothing into everything with impossible speed. They do not occupy territory. They recreate it in their image overnight." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting Atlantic Wall defenses in 1944, had warned his staff, "If the Americans can build airfields on coral atolls in days, they will establish beachheads on our shores before we can react." Speed of construction, not speed of movement, will determine the next phase of warfare. Both commanders were correct. The Seabees had not merely built bases, they had reconstructed the very nature of warfare. They proved that in modern conflict, the speed of construction could be more decisive than the speed of destruction. Every Japanese defensive timeline, every German calculation of American capabilities, every assumption about what was possible in warfare had been buried under millions of cubic yards of crushed coral, laid down by American men who knew how to build and fight with equal skill. Admiral Matomi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, wrote in his final diary entry before his suicide flight on August 15, 1945, "They did not defeat us with superior strategy or tactics. They defeated us with superior reality. They could create the impossible and make it routine. Against such capability, traditional military planning becomes obsolete." The German assessment was equally sobering. Colonel General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The Americans mechanized construction as we mechanized warfare. But where our blitzkrieg ultimately reached its limits, their construction capabilities seemed infinite. They did not defeat terrain or weather or distance. They simply ignored these obstacles and built through them. It was a new form of warfare we never anticipated and could not counter. The motto of the Seabees was, "Can do." In the Pacific War, those 2 words rewrote the mathematics of military possibility and proved that American industrial genius could be deployed not just in factories but on beaches, in jungles, and across coral atolls. The war in the Pacific was won by brave Marines and sailors, brilliant strategists and courageous pilots, but it was made possible by Seabees who built civilization at combat speed, proving that in modern warfare, the power to create could overcome any power to destroy. Their legacy was written not in battle reports but in crushed coral and steel matting, in runways that appeared overnight and bases that materialized from jungle, in the stunned reports of enemy commanders who discovered too late that the Americans had weaponized construction itself, making the impossible routine and the routine unstoppable. The Seabees had not just built bases, they had built victory itself, one impossible runway at a time.